Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Runge, and I am an educational consultant for the Patent Central office. I am a school psychologist by training and trade, and was a practitioner as well as a consultant, and then a trainer of school psychologists in a graduate program for a number of years. And I've returned to the patent system a little less than a year ago, and it is wonderful to join all of you today in a virtual platform around formative assessment practices to inform instructional practices within a classroom K to 12. Admittedly, I am not a teacher by training and trade, and in terms of content, mathematics is probably the subject area with which I am the least familiar as a school psychologist, so I ask for your forgiveness and grace with some of my examples today that I tried to build using mathematics content in building these illustrations and examples. But please understand again that I am certainly a novice when it comes to teaching mathematics and understanding the scope and sequence of mathematics content that we teach from K to 12. And so I ask for your grace if you think that maybe some of my illustrations within the mathematics domain are perhaps maybe a little too simplified. As I noted, I'm a school psychologist and a consultant in school psychology, MTSS, and behavior. And so I feel a little bit out of my element speaking with all of you today about mathematics. But that said, the essence of the content of today's session on formative assessment is something with which I am quite familiar. And so I hope that my experiences and the things that I share with you today will translate back into your roles within your respective settings. I am joined today by Allie Mack, who is one of our school psych apprentices and is working behind the scenes to make sure that this goes well. Allie is going to be monitoring the chat for us because, as you maybe noticed when you entered into the session today, that you are automatically muted. And just given the nature of the number of participants in this session, we're going to keep you muted for the duration of the session, which I know will be a little bit frustrating. However, there still is a way for you to be engaged with us. And so if you wouldn't mind placing your questions or comments in the chat, I am going to do my best to monitor the chat as I am presenting content and discussing today's material. However, Allie is going to be my backup, and she will ensure that if there is a question that I miss in the chat, she has the ability to unmute and can interrupt me, and I've given her that permission to interrupt me whenever necessary to ask a time-sensitive question. Therefore, we encourage you to ask questions. Just please put them in the chat, and if I don't see them, Allie will make sure that those are brought to my attention. Corey Dickey is also one of our colleagues here in the Patent Central office, and he is also behind the scenes making sure that this Zoom platform works well for everybody. And he is being attentive to all of the technology needs that we might encounter throughout our session. So it is with great pleasure, again, that I am joining all of you today and am supported by both Allie and Corey as we discuss formative assessment practices in the classroom for instructional purposes. And we have until 2 o'clock, and I will do my level best to make sure that we get through everything that I had planned for today by 2 o'clock. Allie has been posting in the chat numerous times, and thank you, Allie, the link to the Padlet for today's content, both the slide deck and then some of the resources and activities that I have built into today's presentation. And so the reason Allie is posting this link multiple times is because if new people join, or when new people join the Zoom room, they don't have access to the historical or archive set of posts within the chat feature. So please give Allie some grace as she has to post, or she's been asked to post that link multiple times. Trust me, it's the same link over and over and over again. If you have the link once, you don't have to worry about the subsequent posts that she provides. Okay. So with that, then, I am going to just note again that link here on the right-hand side of the screen is the exact same link that Allie has been putting in the chat. And then for those of you who are maybe a little bit more technologically savvy than I am, there's a QR code on the left-hand side that takes you to the exact same Padlet link. And I'm going to bump out of PowerPoint just for a moment to draw your attention to the Padlet and what contents you will find on it. This is probably the only time, or at best maybe just one of a handful of times, that I will show you the Padlet. But to orient you, the slide deck for today's content is in that first column. The second column are a series of resources, some of which are directly referenced in the slide deck, but not all of them. Those are just additional resources all around formative assessment within the classroom for instructional purposes. And then on the right-hand side are two different links for activities. And the first activity that's listed right there, the KWL chart, is one that you're going to need pretty early on. And therefore, I invite you to access the Padlet using, again, the link that Ali has posted multiple times in the chat, or that you maybe took the screenshot of the QR code and download that that KWL chart to your device. Because in a matter of a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you to start becoming engaged in the lesson for today by utilizing that KWL chart. So that activity document is there. And then later on in today's session, I will do what I refer to as a brain dump. And that this website here just provides some basic review of what that activity is, but you will not necessarily need to access this brain dump activity for today. It's just a resource, really, more so than an activity per se. So again, if there are only two things that you download from the Padlet, I would recommend you download the slide deck on the left-hand side, and then the very first activity, which is the KWL chart. And the KWL chart is what we will be using here in a matter of a few minutes. As you probably have guessed, KWL chart is something that I'm going to be talking about as well as utilizing in our presentation today as a method of engaging learners in their own learning in a formative way so that we as an instructor can ascertain the extent to which our students are mastering the learning objectives. There are, of course, other means by which we can formatively assess our learners' mastery of content, not just using a KWL chart, but other strategies as well. And so to get us to practice some of those additional strategies within a Zoom environment, I'm going to, at times, ask you to post in the chat. Now, to make sure that we're all on the same page with regard to how to access the chat, if you have used Zoom before, this will be old news, a review. If, however, you're less facile with the Zoom platform, then I'm going to walk you through very explicitly, hopefully, with step-by-step instructions as to how to access the chat. So what I'd like you to do right now is move your cursor around to the border of your screen. For me, using a PC, I go to the top of the screen, and then all of a sudden a toolbar appears. And so your toolbar, if you're using a PC, will look something like this. If you're using a Mac, I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I'm imagining it will look something similar to this. And notably, what you want to do is find the chat icon and click on that, which will then open up the chat for you to see what everybody is talking about in a synchronous manner throughout today. Because what I'd like you to do right now is very briefly in the chat, just provide your title and the school district in which you are employed so that we all can get a sense for who is here with us today. There are 46 of us, myself, Ali, and Corey included, so this will be a pretty quick cascading event. Please go ahead then and indicate your title and your school district. Thank you. Give you a few moments to do that. Thank you all for engaging in this. So we have Caitlin from West Shore. I'm just going to randomly call out people in a good way. You don't have to respond, but Caitlin from West Shore. We've got Jeanette City from Chandra. We got folks from Pendelco. Thank you, Sarah. Good to have School Sykes in the house. All right, fantastic. So what I am seeing here is clearly a nice representation geographically across our Commonwealth, which is wonderful. And I'm also seeing a nice array of professional roles from Lindsay, our second grade teacher, Amy, a fourth grade teacher, through, as I noted earlier, School Sykes. We got some middle and high school mathematics teachers. We have some administrators as well. We have some colleagues from the private and parochial domains. So we have a very nice swath representation of both geography across the Commonwealth as well as roles. and then up and down the continuum of elementary, middle, and high school. So thank you all for engaging in that brief activity, just so that I can get a broad view of who here is in our audience, and you too as well can see who some of our colleagues are on this call. Fantastic. So thank you. The next thing I'd like us to do a little bit of practice in is to utilize another feature within Zoom that I really like to use that is a way of engaging everybody in a virtual environment such as Zoom, and that is the annotation feature, specifically stamping. If you are, again, not as familiar with stamping, then don't worry, I've got step-by-step instructions here with screenshots relevant for a PC environment. If you're using a Mac, again, I understand these images will look very similar, but they may not be identical to what is presented before you. So the first thing, again, in order to be able to stamp, is you want to, once again, find that toolbar by typically going, again, along the border of your screen. And then what you will see is there should be an icon that looks like a pencil. Similarly, a shortcut actually is in most Zoom environments down in the, at least in my orientation, the bottom left corner is that same icon, that pencil. And when you actually put your cursor over it, it'll highlight it and note it that it is the annotate feature. So you want to click on that icon. Then after you do that, you should see another toolbar up here, refer to it as an annotation bar, in which you have a whole lot of options. Now, the option that you are going to check or select is the check mark option that is highlighted there in the red box. Once you do that, then you get to pick the way in which you are stamping on the screen. So in short, the stamping feature allows you to make an impression on the screen that everybody else can see. The type of impression that you make is listed here in step 3. So you get to pick what your image is that's going to identify your selection or your stamp on the screen. As a school psychologist, I can assure you that selecting the stamp is not a projective test. This doesn't tell me or anyone else anything about your personality or anything like that. It is just simply a choice that you can make. So you pick one of those, and then once you start doing that, every time you click your mouse or your touchpad, your stamp will appear on the screen for everyone else to see. So you want to make sure that before you are done stamping, or excuse me, when you are done stamping, when you are ready to stop stamping, you pick the red square with a white X. That will stop you from stamping. If you don't do this 4th step, then every time you click your mouse or click your touchpad, you're going to stamp on the screen and everybody else is going to see it. You may not want to do that for the duration of our session today. In fact, you're only going to want to do that at prescribed times. So therefore, there's a 3-step process as outlined in steps 1, 2, and 3 for selecting the stamp you're going to use. But don't forget that 4th step, making sure that you stop stamping following that 4th step. Otherwise, you will inadvertently continue stamping on the screen when you don't want to be stamping. So here we go. So let's just practice stamping a bit. Go ahead, do annotate, then stamp, and pick your stamp. It's not a projective, so pick whichever one and just stamp away. Fantastic. I appreciate everyone stamping, and you might have noticed that as you stamp for at least a brief moment, your name, your Zoom ID will appear next to your stamp, but then it does go away. Okay. So I'll give you maybe another 15 seconds to stamp. And then in a moment, okay, stop stamping in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I magically made all the stamps go away. That was on purpose. So don't stop stamping just yet, because on this screen, it's summer. For some of you, you're either just finishing up school year, or I'm aware of a few school districts that still have students coming throughout this week. So thinking of where are you in Pennsylvania, or if you happen to be outside of Pennsylvania, we do have a location for you to indicate where you are. So please tell us where you are right now. Fantastic. So we have a decent concentration of participants who are from the eastern third of our state, some more in central. We're still a little light on the west end of our state. And we have at least one individual who has stamped that they are not in Pennsylvania, which is understandable again, especially if you work in a school district that is on the border of our great Commonwealth, or if you are one of those lucky individuals who the school year is already over and you're elsewhere, maybe on vacation. And if you're on vacation and you're attending this conference, kudos to you, because that is a huge commitment to mathematics instruction. All right, so I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to stamp where you are, and then we do have one more stamping activity before we move on, but 10 more seconds. 5. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I would like you to next. Here's the last time I'm going to have you stamp. Again, thinking of it's summer break for many of us, and for a few of us, summer break is just beyond our reach. Where would you like to go on a dream vacation? So go ahead and indicate where you wish to go on a dream vacation. So this is your dream vacation. Maybe your dream is a reality, but it doesn't have to be a reality. It could be something that you aspire to do in the future. Fantastic. Got some folks interested in going down under, Europe, Caribbean, Hawaii. Got a couple of folks interested in Hawaii or the Western United States. Greenland, way upper province of Canada. Fantastic. Someone who wants to go down to South America. Wonderful. I'll give you about another 10 seconds to indicate your dream vacation. If you're done stamping, then make sure at this point in time that you click that red square with a white X, because we're going to stop stamping for a while. Last call for stamping on your dream vacation. And at this point now, I invite each and every one of you to make sure within that annotation bar, you've clicked on the red square with a white X. Because if you don't do that, you will continue stamping. And at this point moving forward, I don't have any stamping activities in the immediate future. So you want to make sure you've stopped annotating and stamping. Okay. So what I have done just right now, hopefully by way of illustration, is described for you and then subsequently illustrated how we could use some formative assessment practices in a virtual environment via stamping and using the chat. Now, for most of you, however, you are not typically teaching in a virtual environment, but I wanted to at least share a couple of ways in which we can formatively assess the degree with which our learners are engaged in our lesson using some tools built within Zoom. I do appreciate, however, that at least there is the possibility that some of you on this session are teaching in a virtual environment and therefore could be using chat and stamping features as a way to engage your learners and also assess the extent to which they are mastering content in a formative way. However, for most of you in this workshop, you're not typically teaching in a virtual platform, and consequently, your formative assessment practices probably won't look too much like what we've just gone through, but instead will take the form and shape of more traditional approaches that I hope you walk away from today's session having a greater appreciation for the range of things that you might deploy. So in essence, finally, after 20 minutes now of our session already, we finally get to what is this session about. I am certainly not here to insult your intelligence by reading the abstract. It is presumed that you selected this session either A, because you had nothing better to do, or B, the abstract seems somewhat appealing to you in your practice, hopefully the latter and not the former. But when we take that abstract and then operationally define what are the learning objectives, this is what I hope you walk away with today in the next 55 minutes. And that is, number one, Identify the types of assessment and what are their purposes. That's going to be relatively quick. Then diving much more deeply into number 2, which will constitute the bulk of our session today, in which you should be able to describe the process of developing, implementing, and evaluating your formative assessment practices. And then thirdly, this is at the tail end of our session today, and then leading out into your work into the next academic year, is how do you apply the content from today to your own setting, whether your setting is a classroom teacher, a building administrator, a school psychologist who is providing consultative support to teachers and administrators, or your district level person who is focused on how do we improve outcomes for all students. And I would submit that formative assessment is one way in which we can do that. Therefore, what I'd like you to do as we begin on our journey around formative assessment is I'd like you to revisit that KWL chart that was posted in the Padlet. Please note that any slide that has this little Padlet icon in the upper right-hand corner means that there is a resource or a link associated with content on this slide that can be found in the Padlet. So for anybody who joined us a little bit late because they were scarfing down the last few bites or gulping down the last few sips of their drink, the Padlet link has been provided multiple times. And Allie, if you could do that one last time in the chat, please, thank you. Then in the Padlet, which will be linked and has been linked, here is that KWL chart. And all you got to do is just click on it. And actually, if you go to the 3 little dots up here in the upper right-hand corner, you can then download the resource to your own device, just like I have done here. And what I'd like you to do is spend just, I know I put in the PowerPoint 5 minutes, but I think it's probably a little too much. Let's spend 2 minutes jotting down what do you already know about formative assessment and what do you want to know. So the first 2 columns of our KWL chart. You are not submitting this for verification to me or anyone else. So it is the honor system that you fill out what you already know about formative assessment and what you want to know about formative assessment. And instead of 5 minutes, I'm just going to restrict us to 2 minutes. So I'm going to mute myself for 2 minutes, start my timer, and in 2 minutes, it is expected that you fill out what you want, what you already know, and then also what you want to know. So go ahead. Okay, we have 1 more minute left. Again, 1 more minute to fill out the first 2 columns with regard to formative assessment. What do you already know about formative assessment? And then what do you want to know or what do you wish to learn? Five, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, thank you all for engaging in that initial activity around a KWL chart. As you probably might be aware, a KWL chart is yet another strategy we can employ that is a formative assessment of student learning. Right now, we're looking at what do you already know and what do you hope to learn? And then, as you probably imagine, particularly if you are familiar with the KWL chart, at the end of today's session, I will allocate a little bit of time for you to jot down what did you learn? And that could be an exit ticket, for example, in a classroom setting that you collect as students are exiting the class, and then you use that information to ascertain the extent to which they mastered your learning objectives. Rest assured, however, I am not going to ask for nor collect your KWL charts at the end of today's session. Okay. Let's first talk about the different types of assessments and their purposes. And I'm going to do this relatively quickly in the interest of time. And also, this content tends to be a little bit dry for people who are non-school psychs, recognizing that school psychs' whole lives, their whole professional vocation is built off of this understanding of assessment. And I appreciate that not everybody on this call is a school psych. So very quickly, the main purpose of a classroom assessment is to gather valid and reliable data that is useful for instructional planning and can help instructors ascertain the extent to which their students are mastering the content. The challenge, however, with assessment is that we have to be really clear as to what is being measured and then precisely define that so that we can develop or construct tasks or assessment features that evaluate the extent to which our learners are mastering the things that we want them to master. Consequently, not all assessments are created equally, they're not all the same, and they are not all for the same purposes. Therefore, we need to understand, where does formative assessment fit within the broad umbrella of assessment practices? When we think about classroom assessments, we can design such assessments to be used before, during, and after instruction. Classroom assessments that we deploy before instruction help us to do a couple of different things, one of which is to ascertain a student's readiness for learning the content that we have developed for that particular lesson. And then we can also use before instruction assessments to place students or make instructional modifications to what and how we're going to teach, and then maybe also how we're going to assess a student's mastery of the learning objectives. So that can all be done via classroom assessments before we even deliver instruction. During instruction, there are a whole host of classroom assessments that we can develop, and for the purposes of today's session, really focused on that formative assessment product, which helps us as instructors determine where are students mastering content, where are they having misconceptions, or where are they making errors. We can use data from assessment practices that are formative in nature to monitor students' progress and then deliver feedback in real time, not only to students, but also to ourselves, so that we can adjust our instruction while we are teaching, as opposed to teaching something and then waiting 2 weeks to find out whether students actually mastered what we have taught. Consequently, formative assessment is the bedrock, in my humble opinion, of good, effective instruction. And we can utilize that during instructional processes, as we will see throughout the rest of our session today. Then once instruction has occurred, in other words, after the lesson, then we can use assessment practices that are more summative in nature to ascertain the extent to which our learning objectives were met. And that information is valuable to students, but also us as instructors. But the data that we get after instruction doesn't help the students who are sitting in that lesson. And therefore, it is these formative assessment practices that are utilized within a classroom lesson that truly can be impactful for not only the students as they're learning, but us as instructors while we are delivering content. So formative assessment really is the feature that I think can be quite helpful and beneficial as we are teaching live in the moment. And then we make decisions as we are teaching about the extent to which we should continue on, backpedal, revisit something because clearly the class has not mastered it, or maybe consider other approaches to ensure that all students are acquiring the knowledge and the skills that are embedded within our lesson. So what is the difference between these terms that are typically used interchangeably between assessment, test, and measurement? Assessment is a very broad term, and it tells us how well does an individual perform. A test is basically the task that we design that helps us understand the extent to which a student is mastering content or how they stand relative to peers on that same task domain. Measurement then is the number or the value that we assign to our assessments to help us understand the extent to which a student has mastered a particular skill or content or strategy, so forth. So there is a difference in the terms that we use, and oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, and I'm going to do my level best to not confuse them by using these terms interchangeably. Again, different types of assessment. The ones in blue are less important for today because they're not specifically relevant for this session. The one in green, however, is a type of assessment that is the focus of our meeting today. So in brief, along the exterior kind of border in blue, you have placement tests that help us determine where a student should be placed before we deliver instruction, and you see some examples listed there. We have diagnostic assessments that help clinicians as well as instructors diagnose where learning difficulties may occur. And again, some examples are listed there. We have summative assessments that all of us in education are very, very familiar with. Some of those examples, of course, would be chapter tests, PSSAs, keystone exams, and so forth. Those are all summative assessments. Then we also have benchmark assessments. Those of you who are employed in schools that are operating under a multi-tiered system of support or an MTSS framework are very familiar with benchmark assessments. These are the oftentimes 3 times a year assessments that we give students, particularly in the elementary grades, to track their progress over different academic and behavioral domains. So some examples are listed there. Those are all different types of assessment that fall under the same broad umbrella of assessment. But the one, again, that is relevant for our conversation today would be formative assessment. And these are assessment practices that are delivered embedded in a lesson plan that help us monitor students' learning and their progress while we are delivering instruction. And some examples are listed here, but please understand I have additional examples in subsequent slides as I go throughout our session here today. But some of those, again, are response cards using whiteboards or dry erase boards. Sometimes that's what they're referred to as. Having kids work in small groups around problem solving, for example, word problems in mathematics, or think, pair, share, or brain dumps. Some of these I have embedded in our lesson here today. So those are different types. Ultimately, the goal of our assessment practices are both to improve student learning and to improve the quality of instruction that we as instructors are delivering. How do we do that? Here is an 8-step process, flow chart per se. You don't have to commit this to memory, but it does give us a nice little orientation as to, first, we got to understand what is the purpose of our assessment, or excuse me, our measurement practices. And in this case, it's going to be formative assessment. Then we need to develop specifications around those assessment tools that we're going to create. More on that in a little bit. Then we select appropriate assessment tasks. We will spend some more time talking about that. Then we develop those assessment tasks, we deliver them, and then we appraise student performance on those formative assessments, and we use those results to gauge whether our instruction was effective or not. If our instruction was effective, then we continue on to the next learning objective. If our instruction was not effective, then we can't just keep moving forward and leave all of our learners in the dust. Instead, we take that data and we revisit our instruction. We tweak what we're teaching or how we're teaching or the way in which we ascertain students have mastered that learning objective. And we then reappraise whether students have mastered that content. So we are adjusting our instruction in the situation, in the moment, so that we ensure that all of our students are mastering our learning objectives. So this is kind of an overall gestalt or an overview of why do we assess student learning and how do we do that? Now, specific to formative assessment, that's the purpose of today. So we've just now concluded a very, very quick surface level view of the different types of assessment and their purposes. I'm going to take a moment to pause and make sure that there are no chat questions that I have not been able to see. But Allie, thank you for posting the KWL chart directly in the chat. So before I move on to our second learning objective, I just want to pause for a moment and make sure that if there are any questions about the different types of assessment and their purposes, please put that in the chat. Okay, there being none in the chat, then I'm going to continue on. And next, we're going to spend the bulk of our remaining time together now describing the process in which we develop, implement, and evaluate our formative assessment practices. First thing, as you will note with the Padlet icon in the upper right-hand corner, there are wonderful resources that Patton has put together linked in the Padlet. We refer to this as our teacher's desk reference bundle, meaning there are a whole host of resources that you can download from the Patton website. So they are linked. That website is linked directly in the Padlet, or here is the link as well. There are about 20 to 25 publications, not all about formative assessment, of course, but around a variety of strategies, approaches, content, and skills that all educators ought to be aware of. These are typically like our grab and go type of resources. And I have just included a short list of some of the other resources that are contained within the teacher's desk reference. But of course, the one that is salient for our conversation today is the one around formative assessment. And so this is a screenshot of the first page of the formative assessment document that you can find in the teacher's desk reference, posted within the Padlet and on the Patton website. So that's there for your perusal. I'm not going to spend any more time talking about it because largely today's session is designed around some of the very things that you will find in that teacher's desk reference. So what I'd like to do now is engage all of you in a quick activity that we refer to as a brain dump. So for 1 minute, when I tell you to, for 1 minute, you're just going to jot down anywhere. You're not turning this in. Jot down anywhere. Actually, no, let's do it this way. Just jot and type in the chat. What are some steps that you can think of related to formative assessment practices? There's no right or wrong answer here. I recognize that not everybody is familiar with the formative assessment process, which is why in part you're here today. So just type in the chat, or if you're not comfortable typing in the chat, that's fine. Then just write it somewhere else. What are some steps along the process for formative assessment? How would you go about building formative assessment? So go ahead and just type those in the chat. I'll give you about a minute. Good, Lindsay, thank you. Identify student objectives. Thank you, Lindsay. Learning targets. Thank you, Jen. You think about what you want students to know or be able to do. Great. So we have a lot of our first couple of comments are around this concept of identifying what do you want kids to learn. Great. Amanda, thank you for indicating that you designed some activities. L. Boland is indicating scaffolded questions to check for understanding. So perhaps maybe like an illustration of a formative assessment process. Good, good, good. Barbara, thank you. Caitlin, good. I appreciate when so many of these are coming in that I can't keep up with acknowledging publicly who has been commenting and what their comments are. So thank you. Got about 10 more seconds. Right, thank you. So 5 more seconds, and then we will continue. Okay, so a brain dump activity, as we just went through, is a very simple activity that one can use within their classroom environment that requires few, if any, sort of resources. You could have students jot things down on a piece of paper, or they can verbalize a brain dump to appear in a think, pair, share activity. But a brain dump, which is linked in the Padlet in terms of its purpose and how to run it, is essentially a way in which we can engage our learners and then perhaps maybe use some of those data to ascertain the extent to which students are mastering our learning objectives. So to that end, let's talk about then the formative assessment process. So on the left-hand side, I really appreciate this image from the Wisconsin Department of Education that gives us a nice view of the various steps of the formative assessment process. Please understand that different renditions of the formative assessment process might have 5 steps or 7 steps or 4 steps. The number of steps is inconsequential. What is important, however, is these core features that we plan our learning targets, our learning objectives. We design practices that will explicitly gather information about the extent to which students have mastered those targets. We interpret the data. And then here's the kicker. We use that data then to adjust not only what we are doing as instructors, but also it gives feedback to students live in the moment so they know themselves whether they are mastering content. So this step over here, I guess it's the 4th step in this visual representation, really is the whole point of formative assessment. Gives feedback to learners, and it also gives feedback to us as the instructor as to whether our practices are having the desired impact. Then, of course, we use those data after the fact to maybe revisit our approach to teaching that particular lesson and maybe consider whether we adjust, modify, or keep our practices the same the next time we intend on delivering that particular lesson. And importantly, this is a circular process. It's always moving in a circle. So each step is informing the next step, and we never ever stop. As a case in point, this is now at least the third time that I've delivered this particular content as a patent employee since I rejoined patent in August. My good colleague and I, Erica Caruter, and I have presented a similar version of this same content at multiple conferences prior to today. Each time we deliver this lesson, we revisit it. We get the feedback from our learners, i.e. you, and then we make adjustments to it so that the next time we deliver this lesson, it is hopefully a little bit more efficacious than the previous times that we have delivered it. So I try to model the very things that I am asking all of our colleagues in education to do. So that's just hopefully an illustration of how we too are using this approach, this formative assessment process, to always improve upon our own instruction as consultants. Okay, so first step of and again, the number of steps is inconsequential, but I do have to enumerate them for us to kind of understand what the heck is going on. So for the very first step of the formative assessment process, we need to identify what are our learning objectives. Learning objectives gives us direction as instruction as to what are the important or salient outcomes of our lesson. They subsequently convey those important features of our lesson to our learners. And then if we write a learning objective very well, then it actually gives us an operational way of measuring the extent to which the student has mastered that learning objective. Because if we don't know what we are teaching, then there's no way we can assess what's important. And instead, if we know exactly what our targets are, then we can build assessment in this particular context, formative assessments that inform the extent to which our students are mastering the learning objectives, and we can subsequently adjust our instruction based upon those formative assessment data. So what is a learning objective or a learning outcome? I hope that everybody on this call is very familiar with it, but just to be sure, it is our intended learning outcome that we want all students to be able to accomplish by the time our instruction has ended. We always want to be using action verbs. So you think of Bloom's taxonomy of verbs that we can rely upon to help us develop learning outcomes or learning objectives that are aligned to the different levels of understanding, whether it's comprehension, understanding, or application or evaluation. Think Bloom's taxonomy. And then we want to consider those action verbs within the context of the standards that we are required to be teaching. And of course, a friendly reminder that your Pennsylvania standards can be found on PDE Standards Aligned System Portal. So we could, for example, go back to our standards, look at what standards we're expected to teach, and then build learning outcomes that use those action verbs from Bloom's taxonomy to then develop a series of learning outcomes across the whole year. And then we telescope, or excuse me, we zoom into what are the specific learning objective or objectives for a particular lesson. Again, the relationship of developing these learning objectives is it very clearly tells the student what it is we're going to be teaching. And the teaching is the process. The product is the learning outcome or the learning objective. So here is an example, again, not being anywhere near an expert in mathematics, knowing that it exists and being very much out of my element, speaking to a lot of mathematics instructors who are subsequently experts in mathematics instruction. So you're teaching your students how to find the area of two-dimensional shapes, but the product is you have them complete a worksheet or complete an activity or maybe a small group cooperative learning activity where they're computing a variety of two-dimensional shapes, the area of a variety of two-dimensional shapes, for example. So that would be the product. The process is how we go about teaching it. Our focus here today is largely on this last piece. What is the product that we can develop that assesses the extent to which students have mastered our learning outcomes. Of course, there are a ton of objectives that we could possibly be focused on, not only across the academic year, but in any one particular lesson. And therefore, it is incumbent upon us as instructors to identify what are the instructional relevant outcomes that are complete, are appropriate, are sound, are feasible for the lesson that we are going to teach for that particular day, and always go back and refine that list to make sure that we have a complete, appropriate, sound, and feasible set of learning objectives for a particular lesson. So once we've identified our lesson objectives, then we need to develop the lesson itself, right? I mean, this again is what good teachers do. They identify the learning objectives and then they develop a lesson that is built around those learning objectives. Now, as we are developing our lesson, we should be thinking about ways in which we can embed formative assessment practices. And again, these formative assessment practices are built around the topic, the objectives, what materials we have, what instructional techniques will we be using, and so forth. So be thinking about, as we develop our lesson, ways in which we can embed formative assessment practices and procedures throughout our lesson. Here is an illustration of an integrated lesson plan that was not created by me. It was created by people who are much smarter and wiser and brighter than I am, colleagues from the comprehensive integrated three-tiered framework out. Kathleen Lane and Wendy Oakes and colleagues who put together an integrated lesson plan. This, by the way, also is posted to the Padlet if you want it as a resource. So without going too deeply into the lesson plan, what I do want to highlight is this particular lesson plan, I think, lends itself very nicely to building formative assessment practices within your lesson. So for example, notice in the opening activity, as highlighted with the red square in the lower left, and then the red, I guess those not are squares. Wow, I'm talking to a mathematics audience and I called it a square and it isn't. How about we just say the rectangle, and then the rectangle in the upper right-hand corner, opportunities to respond. This is where we would highlight within our lesson plan development and subsequent deployment how we can embed formative assessment practices, so opportunities for them to respond to the instruction so that we as the instructor can ascertain, are they learning it or not? We could do that via an opening activity, assessing their knowledge of prerequisite skills, the things they need to have mastered in order to meaningfully profit from the lesson today. And then continuing on, this is just simply the second page of that same lesson plan. We do some modeling, some guided practice, and then we provide independent practice for our learners so that we can, again, in that independent practice stage, build those formative assessment practices within the lesson so we can ascertain the extent to which students have mastered the learning objectives. And then what I also like about this integrated lesson plan, as you see illustrated in the shaded bottom third and highlighted in the red rectangle, is the teacher self-reflecting using a 4-point Likert scale from 0 to 3, the extent to which the teacher themselves provided no, some, partial, or a lot of opportunities for the students to respond. That's that opportunity for students to engage in formative assessment processes that we have explicitly developed and embedded in our lesson, all with the express purpose of trying to ascertain the extent to which students have mastered learning objectives. So again, I really like this lesson plan, this integrated lesson plan, for a variety of reasons, but specifically for our session today, because it explicitly calls out in the process of developing a lesson, how do you embed formative assessment practices? And then after you've given the lesson, you self-evaluate the extent to which you actually delivered the formative assessment processes that you had planned. So a resource that we hope might be beneficial to folks who are interested in this work. So as we're building that lesson plan, as I noted a few moments ago, you want to develop methods for formatively assessing students' mastery of instructional objectives. You want to develop them in advance, make sure that they're varied and they're engaging. You want to embed them in the lesson, and you use those data to adjust instruction, not only for today's lesson, live with those same learners, but then later on, you use that same information to make modifications or adjustments to that same lesson when you deliver it the next time around. In order to do that, we strongly recommend that you develop what is referred to as a table of specifications. So what is a table of specifications? A table of specifications is nothing more than a table or a grid that guides the selection of assessment items or tasks and ultimately facilitates the creation of formative assessment processes and products. Why would you create a table of specification? Well, it gives you an explicit roadmap for building the assessments that you would subsequently embed within your instruction to make you a much more effective and efficient instructor. So how do you develop a table of specifications? First, you prepare a list of instructional objectives. Remember, those are the standards that we're teaching, aligned with action verbs that we use to demonstrate students' mastery of those objectives. And then we outline the instructional content, and we prepare what is referred to as a two-way chart or a two-way table. Two-way just simply means that we are creating a grid or a table that has objectives in rows and then content in columns. What does this look like? Well, right here, here's a prototype of a table of specifications. Notice that the columns are the instructional objectives, and then the rows are content areas. I think I might have said that backward just a few moments ago. My apologies. But instructional objectives are the columns, so we want students to remember, understand, and apply. And then the content area A, B, and C, these are the rows. The intersection of the rows and the columns within a table of specifications is where we would either indicate the number of items. Let's say we're building a summative assessment, and we would indicate the number of items that correspond to content area A around remembering, understanding, and applying that content area A, subsequently for content areas B and C. Or in the case of formative assessment practices, each cell would indicate the type of formative assessment that we're going to use to help us ascertain the extent to which students remember content A or apply content C. What might this look like then? So here's an example of a summative assessment table of specification in grade 5 mathematics. Again, this is for a summative assessment, like an end of the unit or end of the year assessment, for example. But more importantly, for today's purposes, I want to get at what would one look like for the formative assessment process, and I have a prototype of that in just a moment. But to review, the rows are content area, the columns are the learning objectives: identify, understand, apply, evaluate, generalize, and so forth. So here is a way in which I can embed in a formative assessment practice. Now, given that there are a fair number of us on this call, I'm going to ask us to use the chat. We're going to use the chat. That's a little bit easier than doing the stamping. So here's a check for understanding around the table of specifications. Let's imagine Mrs. Gillespie is a 6th grade mathematics teacher, and she begins to create a table of specifications on algebraic concepts. So far, she has this provided. Now, the question then for all of you is, what should go in the columns of the table of specifications? Is it A, assessment methods, B, instructional objectives, C, the amount of content covered, or D, numerical values? In other words, what should go in column, like literally what should go where column A is and where column B is? So go ahead in the chat and indicate your response, either A, B, C, or D. What should be placed in where it says column A or column B? Thank you, Barb, for responding. Amanda, thank you. Jennifer, thank you. Zoe, wonderful. Sarah, Arnold, thank you. Yes, we are getting consensus. The correct answer is, in fact, B. Mrs. Gillespie would replace column A and column B with the instructional objectives for her particular lesson. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. So ultimately then we would take an assessment task or type and ascertain which one is best for each individual learning objective. Here is an illustration of a table of specification for a formative assessment approach around, please forgive me, this isn't necessarily in the mathematics domain, but it is in the domain of elementary science and technology education, safety standards. So general safety, eye safety, and so forth. And then the instructional objectives are around remembering and then applying. And as you can see here, the instructor in their development of the lesson plan and embedded formative assessment practices has identified what are the formative assessment practices, response cards, think, pair, share, brain dump, and so forth, that would be utilized in the lesson to ascertain students' remembering of content and then also subsequently applying that content. So you can see a table of specification, which the earlier rendition gave us an illustration of what it would look like to build a summative assessment. But here we're applying table of specifications in the context of building formative assessment practices that we then embed within our lesson plan. So now let's check our understanding. Let's go back to Mrs. Gillespie, that sixth grade mathematics teacher, and she wants to build a table of specifications on algebraic concepts. Notice here, content is in the rows, and now the learning objectives are in the columns. So what would she list at the intersection of a row and column when she is trying to build a model of formative assessment practices for her lesson? Would she include in the intersection of the rows and columns, A, instructional objectives, B, content, C, which students have met the instructional objectives, or D, how she will assess that learning objective? So please go ahead and put your response in the chats. Thank you, Amy, Sarah, Mrs. Schaefer, Lindsay, Jen, Arnold, thank you. We got a lot of people responding. Thank you. D is the correct answer. And so using this formative assessment practice that I have both described and now illustrate, it seems as though one of my objectives is starting to emerge as being proficient amongst all of you as my learners, and that you are getting a broader sense of what a table of specifications might look like when we are building a formative assessment protocol to embed within our lesson plan. Good. Okay, thank you. So now that we understand table of specifications and its application to a formative assessment process, then the next task, I think, is actually the most creative element of this whole process, and that is coming up with the formative assessment task that we're going to embed in our lesson in the first place. Broadly speaking, you can think of formative assessment tasks in two giant buckets. So one of those buckets would be considered a selection type. These formative assessment practices tend to be very objective in nature, meaning there oftentimes is only one correct answer, and they lend themselves to easy development and also, importantly, very easy, quick, efficient scoring and interpretation. That would include matching, true, false, and multiple choice. The second bucket of formative assessment options are categorized as supply type, and these tend to be referred to as performance-based assessments. These are equally important assessment tasks. They are, however, harder to develop and also much harder to, in the moment, interpret students' performance on supply type tasks that can then inform our instructional practices again in the moment. I can create a supply type or performance-based activity for my students to engage in to ascertain the extent to which they've mastered a learning objective. However, those performance-based assessments maybe are both difficult to develop, and also the product will be hard to interpret in an efficient, or i.e. quick way. So for example, if we want students to build a mathematical word problem around a particular content area that we are teaching in a given lesson, that's going to be a wonderfully rich activity to engage our learners in. However, given that there is really no one singular correct or incorrect answer, it's going to be a lot harder for us as the instructor to gather those performance-based assessments and then ascertain in the moment the extent to which our students have mastered the skill of writing a word problem around a particular mathematical concept. So you can see that supply type assessments, while very valuable, can be much harder to develop as well as get data live while we are teaching. Consequently, while not always the singular utilization of assessment practices embedded within a lesson plan. Selection type or objective formative assessment practices tend to be what we commonly use within a lesson, given their ease of development and subsequently the ease with which we can interpret data coming in from all of our students, again, in the moment. So those selection or objective assessment tasks, again, here are some of those repeated. There are a few others that I'm sure you can imagine, but the simple things would be matching or true, false, multiple choice, short answer, fill in the blank. All of these can be developed relatively quickly, can be embedded within our lesson relatively efficiently, and can give us really rich data very quickly to help us as the instructor ascertain the extent to which our students have mastered content. Just a few moments ago, you endeavored to engage in a multiple choice set of questions that I developed in advance, developed them pretty easily, quickly, embedded them in my lesson pretty quickly, and then I could get data relatively quickly and efficiently ascertain the extent to which all of you had mastered some of those learning objectives for today's session. So again, an illustration of that multiple choice option. Here are some examples of formative assessments in that first bucket of selection or objective domains. So on the left-hand side are those activities that require little to no technology, and then on the right-hand side, maybe some technology, so warm-up activities. Thumbs up, thumbs down, fist to five, meaning a fist means that, like, I don't know what the heck you're talking about, teacher. Five means, oh yeah, I got this. And then they choose the number between 0 and 5 as to the extent to which they understand the content that you are delivering. Now, of course, that fist to five requires honest response from our learners, so you may want to be judicious in using the fist to five approach. However, some other approaches that don't require honest responding and instead require the student to be able to come up with the answer, and then we can understand the extent to which they have actually correctly identified the answer, would be including core responding or think, pair, shares. Those strategies that require at least some technology would be response cards, or if you're really going out on a limb, some online quizzes such as Kahoot and Gimkit. Those are just a few, and I think most educators are very, very familiar with those tools. Our own daughters in my household, I think after a while got tired of Kahoot because that was largely what a lot of their teachers were using. So love the fact that teachers were engaging in some of that formative assessment practice using technology, but we do want to mix it up. Otherwise, our learners get a little bored with using the same technologies over and over and over again. So, of course, there are distinct advantages and disadvantages of each one of those types that you can imagine thinking about and kind of reflecting upon. But in the interest, again, in time, I do want to just highlight some low-tech options right here, the ABCD response card that you can develop, or a true false. So I have these when I'm live presenting to an audience, not virtual presenting, but face-to-face presenting. So a piece of paper that is A, B, C, or D. And then on the back side, you have true, false. And even if I don't make these in advance, I can hand out scratch paper and then have the learners write A, B, C, D on each of the sides and then true, false on the back. And then I can come up with a series of true, false, or multiple choice questions. And then given a prompt, given a cue, they raise their card to respond either to a true false question or a multiple choice question. So very, very easy ways in which we can get a lot of rich formative assessment data in an efficient way from our learners, and we use that information to understand, are they getting it or are they not getting it? So a whole host of formative assessment practices around selection or objective type tasks. Supply performance assessment tasks, as I noted a few moments ago, are a little bit harder to develop, and they're not as efficient in terms of garnering a lot of information in the moment to ascertain the extent to which students have mastered the learning objectives. Typically, in these types of formative assessment protocols, they require a student to respond to either a response that we provided, or we create a situation or some sort of performance that they have to engage in, a task that has to be completed. Oftentimes, there is no single best answer, and particularly around those performance-based types of assessments, we might want to develop some generic rubrics that we can use to then evaluate the extent to which competency or proficiency has been demonstrated on that performance-based assessment. So here are some low-tech and some moderate to high-tech types of formative assessment processes that utilize supplier performance-based approaches. So an entrance ticket, a warm-up activity such as a KWL chart, think, pair, share, or an exit ticket. I think most, if not all of you, have probably used some of these, just maybe haven't thought of them as a formative assessment tool. And then on the SumTech response cards, whiteboards or graphic organizers, I really am a big fan of the whiteboard, where they have the whiteboard and a dry eraser, or a marker and a dry eraser that they can, you can, for example, ask them a question, they figure out the solution to the mathematics problem, they write their answer on the whiteboard, and then upon prompting them or cueing them, they all lift up their whiteboard to display what their response is. Then you as the instructor can quickly scan the room and see how many or which students are getting it and how many or which students are not getting it. So a really helpful, moderately technologically sophisticated approach to embedding a formative assessment protocol around a supply or performance-based task. Just some other ones would be essays or presentations, demonstration. All of these have certainly their strengths, but as you can imagine, the disadvantage of many of these is that, again, they are difficult to create. They're a little bit more labor intensive to deliver as well. And then evaluating student performance on these is not just a simple yes, they got it, or no, they didn't get it. And that leads to some issues around scoring, reliability, the ease of creating that, ease of delivering these embedded within a lesson plan. But nonetheless, these are other options that we could consider when we're developing our formative assessment tools to embed within a lesson. Okay, so once we've then developed our formative assessments, we deliver them within our lesson. Now, in the interest of time, we aren't going to do this think, pair, share, but perhaps maybe if we had more time, we'd think about our favorite teachers. What qualities did they possess? What was it about their teaching that made you consider them an excellent teacher? I'll just share my experiences, and hopefully they resonate with you. Some of the best teachers I ever had were the teachers that engaged me in their learning, in my own learning, and challenged me and provided opportunities for me to demonstrate whether I knew something or didn't know something, and they gave me feedback. So a lot of those elements of what I consider to be my best teachers, or one of those characteristics or traits of the best teachers that I have had, are illustrative of what we know to be an effective lesson that is deployed by a highly effective and efficient teacher. So what I would say to you is these steps that are listed here are, broadly or generically speaking, the steps of an effective lesson. A teacher that states clearly what are the learning objectives, then they review the prerequisites, making sure that students already have the prerequisite skills and knowledge necessary to profit from today's lesson. Then the teacher presents new material. They conduct those learning probes, i.e. those formative assessment practices that they have developed in advance and embed in their lesson. Then they offer independent practice time. And then at some later point in time, they provide some sort of summative assessment protocol to ascertain the extent to which their students have not only mastered that content or those skills, but they've maintained or sustained it over time. And then they provide distributed practice and review, so over multiple weeks, and they kind of embed future learning in with what was taught in this particular lesson. So again, a very, very quick overview, extremely quick overview of the steps of an effective lesson, notably first stating learning objectives so students know what to expect, then reviewing the prerequisites, then presenting new material, embedding our formative assessment practices, and we conduct those formative assessment protocols within our lesson. We develop independent practice time, and then we develop strategies and approaches to assess performance later on, long term, and then we kind of make sure that future lessons build upon the lesson that we just have completed. So here's another check your understanding on those parts of the lesson that I just very, very quickly reviewed. Before teaching the students how to calculate the area of a triangle, Mr. Williams first tells the class they will learn some vocabulary that is necessary to solve for the area of a triangle, base and height. So making sure the students have that vocabulary. He then tells them they will learn a formula to use to calculate the area of a triangle. Mr. Williams is demonstrating what part of an effective lesson. Is it stating the learning objectives, presenting new material, reviewing prerequisites, or conducting learning probes? Put in the chat A, B, C, or D, please. All right, so we're coalescing around A and a couple of other responses. The correct answer here is, in fact, A. Now, If I had unlimited time, I would go back and review the previous slide because the previous slide gives you the answer for this one. And not everyone got this one correct, which is not a fault of you. It's a fault of my rushed instruction. So I was hoping that everybody would get A, but not everyone did get A. That's okay. That's instruction that needs to be revisited. And again, if we had time, I'd go back and revisit the previous slide to really emphasize that first step of an effective lesson, which is state the learning objectives. Very quickly then, same situation, but now prior to distributing a worksheet to the class to practice calculating the area of a triangle, classroom teacher reviews the formula and important terms in the formula, which were presented in yesterday's lesson. What step of the lesson is illustrated here? Is it A, present new material, B, state learning objectives, C, review prerequisites, or D, assess performance and provide feedback? So please put your response in the chat. Here I'm seeing thank you, Kim and Lindsay and Justine and Anne, Barbara and Jen. C, here is the correct answer. You are correct. This is an illustration of a highly effective and efficient teacher reviewing the prerequisites from yesterday's lesson to make sure that students will be able to profit from today's lesson, which builds upon yesterday. Fantastic. So once we've formatively assessed our students during the lesson, and again, here are those broad steps of an effective and efficient lesson plan, really focused on our formative assessment practices during the lesson, then we adjust our teaching based on those assessments. We can adjust our teaching based on pre-lesson assessments, or in the context of today's workshop that is rapidly coming to a close, our within lesson adjustments, and then our post-lesson adjustments. So what I'd like you to do is think about this. When we are delivering formative assessments in a class, here is a simple way of viewing results of the data that we collect. If all students have demonstrated mastery on our formative assessment protocol, then congratulations, you're a highly effective and efficient teacher. Move on to the next lesson objective. If, however, some students are demonstrating mastery of that learning objective, but not all, then consider the following. Summarize the new content or skill and perhaps maybe reteach, highlighting the main points of that learning objective. Maybe consider changing how you teach that skill or content that was not at proficiency for all students, and maybe consider some peer-assisted approaches or reassessing them after reteaching that particular learning objective. If, however, you deliver a formative assessment protocol and no students demonstrate mastery, then stop, go back, reteach, rephrase, reteach, rephrase, use a different instructional approach, maybe use different instructional materials, maybe do a lot more modeling, so a lot more I do, a lot more we do, and then reassess their learning using different formative assessment protocols. So the data that we collect either within a lesson, or you could also use this framework after a lesson, is important because we're collecting those data to ascertain the extent to which a student has mastered the content. And if all students have mastered it, congratulations. If not every student has mastered it, then there are some approaches we should utilize to revisit content before moving on. And if no student has mastered the content that we are trying to deliver, then we absolutely hard stop, need to go back and reteach everything. So in our remaining 1 minute, and I apologize that I was long-winded, but in our remaining minute, what I would ask you to do is go back to your KWL chart, complete what you've learned through this lens. How will you apply at least one concept from today's session into your practice, recognizing that for many of you, the next time you're practicing your craft, your skill, will be a few months from now because you're on summer break. But I invite you again to just go back to that KWL chart and think about what is at least one way in which you can apply today's content to your practice as a teacher, as a building principal, as a central administrator, as a school psychologist, as any educator, as we support our educator colleagues in delivering high quality and effective instruction to our learners.